death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the middle of a pandemic, has really opened up the racial divides in the United States and also the cultural and socioeconomic divides as well. While I lived in the Twin Cities back in the early 2000s, I became acquainted with Charles Hallman, who was a fixture at women's sports events and men's sports events, and in particular in developing relationships with our black athletes on the Minnesota teams. I appreciated his writing. He wasn't afraid to call people out. He wasn't afraid to say we can do this better. And so I reached out to him this week to try to get his take on the riots that happened in Minnesota, whether he knew George Floyd, and what it means to be a black man living in the Twin Cities trying to report on sports at this day and age. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. The epicenter of this racial justice movement has been in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the death of George Floyd has brought a lot of questions from the background into the foreground. Today, I wanted to bring somebody whose opinion I trust and whose viewpoint I think is valuable and unique to our podcast. Journalist Charles Hallman has covered sports for over 4 decades for radio and print in the Twin Cities. Women's sports and diversity in sport issues are his primary coverage areas. He has written for the Minnesota Spokesman-Recorder, the oldest black newspaper in Minnesota, for 30 years, where he writes 2 weekly columns. He has been recognized locally, regionally, and nationally for his work and has won multiple awards over the years. He is also the longest tenured beat writer for the University of Minnesota women's sports teams, 33 years. That's remarkable. And the Minnesota Lynx of the WNBA for the team's 21-year history. And true fact, Charles and I knew each other from my days at the University of Minnesota. So, Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate the opportunity. This Zoom stuff is I'm trying to get used to it. I made a joke that the only thing I knew about Zoom was a title for a Commodore song back in the 70s.
I do remember that song, so that should tell us both how old we are, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's great to see you. And of course, I want to get your initial thoughts on everything that happened in Minneapolis. I assume a lot of that was on Lake Street. I heard initially it was at 38th in Chicago, not far from where I lived for a period of time. Tell us from your perspective how things are.
Yeah, it spread from 38th. In fact, 38th in Chicago is basically has been closed in terms of memorial. They took over that whole section. Then it went to East Lake Street. So it went from basically where Hiawatha is, going east towards St. Paul. That's where most of the protests and the destruction happened. But that took place maybe 3 days, so to speak. But the protest has been pretty much downtown at the government center, some locations around the city. They had the big march. They shut down the free 35W by the university. If you heard about the truck that almost ran over, that was a poison evidence. St. Paul had some places too. They had protests going to the governor's. So there's been some relief, so to speak, but it hasn't been a day that something hasn't going on here locally. And the thing about it, and I've been for the whole world got to see things that we've been seeing here in Minneapolis for a long time. And secondly, will this really push for real change? And I think that's where people are these protests are really amazing to me, is that you have so many young people who are now saying enough is enough. They're being peaceful about it, but they really think this is going to move this forward. And since we've all been cooped up for the last 3 months, I think all that came to a head. And the concern is, they're out there with no social distancing, those type of things. But just the fact that I think the conversation, people really think it's going to move forward. Really, people really going to be serious about this. I talk to people at the U. they really putting in some things in place, and they really listen to people. And I think that's been the biggest thing. People been saying it forever, but I think people really heard it. And unfortunately, George Floyd, people saw that. And I think that brought everything to home.
Had you crossed paths with George Floyd at all in your career?
Be honest, I never met him before.
Okay. Because he's a former athlete, so I just didn't know if you had perhaps.
Yeah, he had. I don't know how long he'd been in Minnesota, so I think his athletics was back in Texas.
Okay.
So I don't know if he did anything here. I met one person that knew him, and they said for all general purposes, he was a nice guy.
Yeah.
And didn't deserve to leave the way he left.
Absolutely. Charles, you've been calling out people for a long time about the lack of a Black presence on athletic rosters at the University of Minnesota, the lack of a Black administrative team at the University of Minnesota. And that's one of the reasons why I felt that you had such a valuable voice, is that you were calling out on behalf of making the institution a better, more diverse institution, and also helping our teams, understand why diversity matters on a team. Where did that come from in your journalism? What made you start to actually write columns about that?
That's a good question, and I don't know. I'm influenced, or was influenced, or still influenced by Richard Lapchak and his report cards. Just the fact that our business, the journalism business, is one of the few last bastion of lack of diversity. And it's sad that you have to you go to cover an event, or you work on an event, and you're the only one, or one of few.
Right.
And I think that we all have our own perspectives, and we bring something to I hate to use the word, we bring something to the table. We have experiences that we can share that you might not know anything about, or you might not understand why that athlete acts the way they act, or why they don't smile like you want them to smile, or why they seem to be so suspicious to you. And I think when I was in college, I was at a predominantly white institution. And so therefore, there was only like 50 of us in our journalism program. And so therefore, of all my years of going to journalism school, I never took a class when another person looked like me.
Wow.
And so therefore, I had professors that didn't look like me. I had students that didn't look like me. And I'm trying to learn a craft that don't want me in it, or will be reluctant to get me in it. So, all that came into help. So it was natural for me to speak on that. And luckily that people heard me, and because I think that's that's an area that's not talked about enough, and not talked about enough by the major newspapers or people who really make it. They want to say, they give it a little short spliff about it, rather than saying, this is something that's important. And I've heard that, and not in a tokenism kind of way. Okay, I don't want you to put a Black person on your board or on your team on this just so you're gonna check off the box, because that's not fair at all. Okay, it's not even fair to have a white person on an all-Black team and say that's going to check off the box. I think what you have to do is, if they are the best person, then good. And that's always been my argument, Karen, is that if you interview a Black for a position and they didn't fit your criteria because they didn't fit it, I'm fine with that. Yeah. What I'm not fine with, if you don't give them that opportunity to even interview.
Yeah.
Or give them a chance to even present themselves, or you already have your mind made up.
Mm-hmm.
That's my argument about the Rooney Rule in the NFL. I think that that's just a sham right now. It's always been one, because you already have your mind made up. And so that tokenism is something that's more insulting than not even getting an opportunity to interview.
So looking at higher education in the Twin Cities, there's of course the University of Minnesota, but there's a lot of small colleges too. Just a bunch of small colleges within an hour and a half drive. What's your sense of their commitment to diversity, first in higher education, and then let's talk about sports?
I think it's the same at all levels. MEIC is still lacking in diversity. It's interesting that, and it's amazing that in 2019, Augsburg fielded a primary Black female basketball team. the first time in history.
Wow.
And we covered them and they finished second two times in a row. Unfortunately, they couldn't beat St. Thomas, and then they beat Bethel. But the MIC commissioner came to me and said, because of my writing about that, that's forcing the league now to look seriously about becoming more diverse all the way through. And that's my job, Karen. My job is try to get people to see that and move it forward, not to take credit for it, just to move it forward. But the MIC is, there's still that problem of making sure that diversity really means something, not just say it because it sounds good or a catchy term, but really you want people to have voices, the different voices that makes a difference. Even when I write a story, Karen, I want different voices. They don't have to always be all Black, but I want different voices because then you can learn something. I can learn something from you, Karen, that I might not learn from someone else. Or you can learn something from me that you might not learn from someone else. But if you don't have, or neither of us are there, then you hear the same old voices. And they're just like echoes and not going to change.
Let me ask you something, and this is, again, my perception of being in Minnesota just for 4 years. But, I felt like at times I felt like I understood it, and other times I really continuously felt like an outsider because I wasn't a native Minnesotan. Do African Americans, or maybe just yourself in particular, do you feel like you're an insider, or do you still feel like you're fighting as an outsider?
Well, I am an outsider. I wasn't born here.
Right.
I was born in Detroit.
You've been there for how many years?
I've been there longer than I've been in Detroit, to be honest. But, but yeah, I am an outsider, and that gives me a unique viewpoint.
Yeah.
Because Minnesota has that lowness, if I can say, of things doing well. People are accepting, but that underlining message is that we don't want you here, or we only want certain people here. But it's not obvious because this is Minnesota. Minnesota is so liberal, those type of things. I heard somebody told me last week, it's that liberal racism that's almost worse than the other kind of racism because you make people feel comfortable. And therefore, when somebody like me or someone from the outside see things and see it for what it is, it exposes, it takes a little layer off of it. And so what happened with Mr. Floyd took a big layer of it. Right. And now the whole, I had people call me and tweet me and say they didn't know that. We thought Minnesota was so liberal and so this. No, it's not. Okay, it's like any other place in this country. It has problems.
Right.
And so therefore, when you're not accepting of it, it makes a difference. But I think I can see it clearer than I know people that was born here in Minnesota, and they get surprised because they was born here. And so when you come up, we bring a perspective. Brought a perspective from where you're from. I brought a perspective from where I'm from. I can see things a little different, not objectively, so to speak, but more differently. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I can see, this is going on. They said, "Wow, we didn't know that was going on." Well, you've been living all your life. You should know that. But if they separate, they do that. They like to separate the chaff from the wheat. They separate the so-called good ones and push them and leave everybody else behind. And so that's something I saw right away, and almost immediately when I came here in 1981, I saw that almost immediately because I was brought here to work as an editor at a now defunct Control Data, and the first thing my boss told me to do, they didn't tell me where the Black community was living at. They had me want to live out in the suburbs. Because in his mind, I wasn't gonna be here for a couple of years anyway. I wasn't, I was gonna get tired and leave, which I almost did because it was too cold here. but until I reached out and found there was Black churches, found there was a Black community, I wasn't encouraged to live out, to move into the city. They wanted me to stay out out in the suburbs. So I noticed that right away that was that subtleness of, well, you're not from here, so we don't want you to be a part of that group.
Got it. So let's take that into recruited student athletes from not from Minnesota, recruited from Florida or Texas or Ohio or other places. How do they then function in this world that they're dropped into?
I think first of all, it becomes a Shangri-La for them. If you grew up in an environment that's been rough, tough, whatever, and now you come here and you see all the beautiful trees and the lakes and all these kind of things, that lure you into, wow, this is nothing I've never been a part of. And so therefore, again, you come in here for one or two reasons. You come here to get a degree, hopefully. You also come here to play sports. And now you are away from all the stuff that you dealt with growing up in an environment that maybe wasn't the most conducive, whatever. But then when you get here, you either get awakened or not awakened. What I mean by that is you realize that you are isolated. First of all, as an athlete, you're isolated because they put you on a separate track. And then you find out that you're not, only people you really associate with is your athletic brothers and sisters. You don't get a chance to interact with the so-called regular students. And so therefore, if something happens on campus, you are looked at as the spokesman, the black person, the black spokesperson to speak on why that happened, okay?
Right.
And why would you be shorted with that? But because you are the only one there, or you one among the few, and so therefore you are asked to speak for the masses, so to speak, and to justify what happened or what didn't happen. And so therefore if you rebel against that, so there's been some that did, they felt the wrath of that, not so much from their teammates, but from the school itself. So yeah, I think, and then you leave it. I mean, after 3 or 4 years, you got a degree, you go, I mean, I know some who stayed here and made a life out of some. A lot of them just, hey, they go back home, or they found other places to go, whether playing sports professionally or moving into their professional lives as a job. And so Minnesota's always been that what do you say, a way station or a stop off, not a temporary, not temporary place. Again, I didn't know I was gonna be here as long as I've been here.
Yeah.
But I did.
Yeah. So one of the things that's unique about the Twin Cities has been the growing population of Somalians. When I had first moved there was a growing population of Hmong as well. Mm-hmm. What impact do you think that has had on the dynamics?
It has been difficult impact, and why I say that is it's unbeknown, it's not well publicized. It's a very strain between the Somalian and the Black community, because Somalians look at the Black communities here as being just like white people. Okay. And then now the Black community look at the Somalians as being treated special because they are foreigners, so to speak. And so it's been that tension. And so it's more pronounced at the high school level, more so in college. There's been some schools that's becoming more Somalian populated, and that's causing tension among the so-called American-born Blacks. But then again, it brings another layer of, how should I say it? Now you put the Somalians ahead of the Blacks, in that pecking order. Yeah. Okay, because they're not from here. Okay, so they're more special than you are. So now you promote their businesses, you promote their economic objectives, and then you push Blacks further back. So that creates another divide and conquer mentality. That's bad. I know a bunch of Somalians, and you get to know them, they fine. Well, we as Black people can be more judgmental sometimes than anybody. And so it's been a real big strain here in Minneapolis. St. Cloud's had an issue there because they have a large population there, and because the meat packing and all those industries up there, so they're being hired. And so it's been a strain, but I see it a little bit. I see it better because you have Somalians now in the city council here. You have Representative Omar, who unfortunately lost their father to COVID. So you're seeing them progressing into the political realm, but it's almost like, again, they're not being fully accepted by the so-called American-born Black community.
Right. So in your time, I'm guessing you have crossed paths with Kevin Warren when he worked with the Vikings.
Yes.
Well, now, as you well know, he's the Big Ten commissioner, and he has launched an anti-hate and anti-racism initiative. What are your thoughts on that?
It was funny about that. He was doing his tour of all the Big Ten campuses. In fact, he came here in February. And so I asked him point blank. I say, first of all, you're the first Black commissioner of the Big Ten, blah, blah, boo, boo. I asked him, what are you going to do to promote diversity and inclusion as a Black individual? And he talked about that, not in name form. He talked about that would be one of his initiatives to make sure that that's always the inclusion, diversity, or dealing with people generally would be something of a focus. So that doesn't surprise me. I met him several years earlier at a function. He seemed to be very genuine in his thoughts. He's always been generous with me when talking with him. The NFL is such a tough group to deal with, but he's helped me a couple of times when I had some issues I need to deal with the Vikings. He stepped up. People who know him tell me he's a very honorable man. From the times I talked with him, he was very honorable, and he's genuine with it. So having this come out doesn't surprise me. The issue would be, Karen, whether he can get other people to buy into that. Yeah. Because you can start that initiative, but if you don't get 100% buy-in, then it becomes auto talk, or it'll fall down the wayside unless you really get people to push it besides him. He's only one man. So he's in his office in Chicago. So can he get Minnesota? Can he get Purdue? Can he get Iowa? So he can get them to buy into what his vision is. Once that happens, then I think it'll work. But I applaud it. But again, there's a lot of things happening, Karen. I mean, I had a man tell me the last time he saw something of this magnitude was after Dr. King got assassinated. But it only lasted a couple of days. But to see the world protesting on an everyday basis, it's not like once in a while they protest on an everyday basis, and faces of different races are protesting. This might make this, in addition to the virus, it might make the tipping point to make this into a stop talking about this and really moving this to action. And that's something. If that happens, I never thought I'd see a Black president in my lifetime, but if I see serious change in my lifetime, I can go to heaven and be happy. I can write there for eternity.
And maybe all the writing you did made a difference, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's build on that idea of the movement and this racial justice movement. And a number of Black athletes just in the last week and a half have stepped up and called out their institutions or even their head coaches for not being responsive and sensitive to the moment. What do you think about this stepping up of Black athletes in particular, but in athletes in general?
I'm really surprised. I think they feel comfortable that they have power now that they didn't have before. I've always wished they would speak out more. When you're an athlete, you are considered a leader. And why can't you speak out? But I think there was fear of retribution. I think there was fear of losing their scholarship. There was fear of other things. And I think you saw it happening in the after 2010. You saw several athletes starting to speak out because when things happen, it could be you. Ryan Sanders said that could have been one of his teammates instead of George Floyd. So therefore, those kind of things hit home because you can really empathize with it. I have two sons, two adult sons. That could be one of my sons. Yeah. So therefore, it's a painful experience, and you feel that, and sometimes you just can't. You can keep it in, then you get ulcer, all the other stuff. So I think now students are feeling more comfortable that they can speak out like the regular Black students can do. They don't feel that they will be ostracized. And because this movement has spread like wildfire, is that they feel they have support. And so far, the school officials has not publicly not backed them. Now, again, we don't know what this leads 3 months from now. We don't know where this goes 6 months from now. Because again, this thing changes every day. I mean, this virus is not going away. There's still some issues with health and safety. Will this continue to be a movement or a moment? That's the issue right now. If it becomes a movement, we're going to see change. When it becomes a moment, that means 6 months from now, we go back to business as usual.
Yeah.
And so therefore students would go back into their shadows and they'd be scared to speak out. I think that personally, Karen, I think they have now feel they can speak out and they can speak out. They got support, not just from their own teammates, but from the world of speaking out that something did happen to them, a Kaepernick happened to them, that they'll have more support this time as opposed to stepping out on principle, stepping out on protest, and then he just out there like on an island by themselves.
And given more latitude to express that support. For example, it doesn't seem like there'll be as much angst around somebody taking a knee during the national anthem anymore as there was just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's funny about that. You know, it's funny that that's what Colin Kaepernick was doing. He was bringing attention to this whole issue by taking the knee, and he got ostracized for that. And now 4 years or 5 years later, people apologizing, or were the commissioners apologizing to him? Okay, it wasn't ever about the American flag. It wasn't ever about the national anthem. It was about police brutality. Right. It was about the injustices that happens to Black people in this country. That's what he was talking about. He did it in a silent way, and therefore you didn't hear him. Now you hear him now. And it's almost like James Baldwin said, you only hear us when we yell and scream. You don't hear us when we talk quietly. That was a quiet protest. You could have initiated change 4 years ago if you'd have followed up with what he was doing and kept up with that. WNBA players was doing the same thing, wearing T-shirts, okay? They got fined originally and they finally rescinded the fine. But I mean, there's always been those kind of movements, but I think they was always short-lived, I mean, this is not the first, George Floyd's not the first person to die at the hands of the police, okay? There's been others died before them, but they never sustained a protest as listed. And like his family member said, if this pushes forward, his death will not be in vain. I mean, his name would be just as synonymous as Dr. King, as Dr. Gandhi, or anybody that started a movement, or Rosa Parks. His name would be like that if everything moved forward. And it's sad that happened, but again, change sometimes only happens when you really push to change.
Yeah.
You really push them to be uncomfortable enough to say, yeah, you know what, we need to change this. It's not happening in the White House right now, but but they changed that. So therefore, if that happens, and it happens because of what he went through on the May 25th, then you know what, his legacy will be that, and it won't be the fact that he might have pushed a wrong bill, or he didn't, or that he is supposed to resist or that. It'll be that the world saw his life being taken away in 8 minutes and so many seconds. That started a movement. Like Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, that started a movement. I mean, there's always been movements started from just one single act, okay? And so therefore, some was nonviolent, some took people's lives, but that makes it a movement as opposed to a moment that it just protests for a few days and they go away. I mean, that's been 3 weeks now, Karen. Yeah. Almost a month now, protests still going on. And that's unheard of in America.
In Minnesota, but just around the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this as a final question. You're going to be hopefully interviewing athletes as they come back, talking about the upcoming football season or other sports. What kinds of things are you going to be listening for as they talk about their experiences going forward?
I'm going to listen to, do they feel comfortable? Do they feel that they can compete and be healthy doing that? I think there's still that underlying fear factor of coming back and you don't know what's going to happen. It's not going to be like it was. I hate to hear the word new normal. It's not going to be normal anymore. The sports is going to be totally different. Either it's going to be with fans or less number of fans, or it's not going to be allowed fans, or it's going to be wholly, totally different. And so therefore, I've been asking a couple of athletes. I did an interview with a young lady who for the Bahamas actually, and she was able to get back home before they put the travel ban on, and so she missed her spring sport, obviously. And I asked her, I said, "How you feel coming back?" She said, "That's the fear right now. Can I come back and be healthy?" It's not about sports anymore, and sports shouldn't be used as a distraction. But that would be what I would listen to. Are they really comfortable? It's almost like coming back from an injury. You know, once you put your foot down or you fall down, you can get back up and you're all right, then you can keep going. But that uncertainty is, can my body withstand after I had an injury? Or the same thing now, this injury it's a natural injury, it's the virus. So now can we stand that moving forward and be able to do that without fear of getting contracted or getting sick? That's going to be a question that I would ask, and I would keep an eye on personally as we go on. But again, I mean, everything's so uncertainty, Karen. I mean, they still haven't decided we're going to play football yet.
Right.
You know, so I mean, and right now that's I mean, go day by day. I mean, I was talking to a colleague before we got on the podcast. This is the first summer I have not covered sports. I mean, in a true way, I'm at a baseball game on about. I mean, I had plans this summer. I had plans to go and visit, go on a Twins road trip. I had plans to go elsewhere. I'm not going anywhere. Right. I can't go to St. Paul these days. But it's just a different. I can't plan. We can't plan like we used to. It's just that's not in the cards at this point. And looking forward to the fall, we don't even know how that's going to be. One of my oldest sons is a high school football coach, and he's not sure they're going to have fall sports. Because Dad, he told me, how can I have social distancing with 100 kids? How can I, and then how can I ask them to come to practice when they can't come in the school building? Because schools haven't been ruled out. So it's a lot of uncertainties out there, and we aren't getting those answers, or the answers are coming piecemeal. And so, yeah, it's going to be an interesting time. It's challenging, and I will be writing about it as much as I can. But it's going to won't be so much about games and wins and losses, but how people react to this new way of sports that will never be the same again.
Well, I'm going to encourage listeners to follow you on Twitter, to find the Spokesman-Recorder online on the website, read your twice weekly columns. They are thought-provoking, and I just have a sense you're going to be really tapped into this. So, Charles Hallman, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, Karen, thank you for taking a little bit of my time. Sometimes you get tired of watching the reports on TV or listening to the radio or do what I do, which is writing all the time. I enjoy this. This is fun. I hope we can do this again. This is fun, and I enjoyed this very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.